Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Story Time. Glad to have you guys here. Now, this story takes place. Now, remember in the last story, I started working at an auto body repair shop in Orlando, Florida. Well, this story takes place about a year and a half later, after I've been working there over a year, and it's about my first boat. What happened was one afternoon when I was working with my father, I noticed out near the office area of the auto body repair shop, like they had an area where they kept all the stalls. They had 8 stalls, and then they had like an office area. On the other side of the office area, they had a little parking lot there. It was only a little small round parking lot on a little road that was dirt, a little dirt road. It was a side road that went off, and they had it off of a paved road, but it was a little parking area. It was just like to park vehicles while they were waiting to be repaired. And so I noticed in that parking area there was a boat there. It was an old boat. It didn't have an engine on it. It had a trailer. It was sitting on a trailer. It was a 14-foot ski boat. Powder blue color. And it was a nice looking little boat and everything. So me and Pop, we went over and we walked around it, and I took a look at it, and then we went back and we were working in the all afternoon. And so the owner of the auto body shop, he came out and we got talking about the boat. He said that some guy had gave it to him as part payment for some of the repairs that he had done on their vehicle. And it was a partial payment. It was like I guess a down payment or whatever. And he says, what am I going to do with that little boat? He says, I can't do anything with it. It's not. See, the owner of the business, he liked boats, but he liked nice big boats. He owned I think it was a 60 or a 70-foot small yacht that he owned, but he liked big boats. He didn't like small boats, and he didn't have nothing to do with this boat. So somehow the talk come around to, what's he gonna do with it? Is he gonna sell it? And my dad was talking to him, and he says, I don't know, maybe I'll sell it. But he says, I'm not going to get nothing for it. It's got a big hole in it. So the 3 of us walked out, and we were walking around the boat looking at it, and it had this big hole in the underbody. The hole must have been they must have hit a log or something, and it smashed through the bottom of the boat and made this big, long, elongated hole right through the bottom of the boat where it hit a log or something. Anyway, so my dad says, well, what are you going to ask for it? What are you going to sell it for? He says, well, I don't know. He says, maybe I'll try to sell it for $200 or $150. And my eyes widened open, and I started thinking when I heard that price, because it was like, but you got to understand now, back in those days, $150, $200 would be like you trying to sell a boat now for $1,000 or $800 or something like that, So I piped up and I said to him, will you take $100 for it? And he looked at me, and he kind of liked me, because I was a hard worker and everything else. And he said, okay. He said, $100 done. And he stuck his hand out and I shook it. So that's the way things were done back in those days. And, of course, I was expected to pay for the boat. So a day or two later, I came in and I gave him the $100. And that was that. He signed over the paper to me. He had the paper for the boat, and he signed it over to me, and that was it. Signed the title over to me. Now the boat was mine. So my dad helped me get the boat back home again. We pulled it into the front yard up near, and I was ever so proud of it. Little powder blue. She was some pretty little boat. Little powder blue speedy looking boat. I think that's why I kind of really liked it, because it was a speed boat, and I never really had a boat before, and I wanted something that would be fast. So I started working on it. I went into town, and I knew how to work with fiberglass because we work with fiberglass in the automotive industry. For fiberglass and something called Bondo, which is a plastic that's made out of fiberglass resins, and it also has what's called not epoxy resin, but it's called the resins in it are a little bit different. There's two main types of resins that they work with. They work with epoxy resin, and they work with polyester resin. And mostly what I worked with in those days on cars was polyester resin, so I was quite familiar with it, how to work with polyester resin. So I went into the boat shop in D-Land, and I got a whole bunch of what's called woven roving and fiberglass cloth. And in those days, it was dirt cheap. I think woven roving was only like $2 a yard, square yard, and the fiberglass cloth was even cheaper in those days. I think it was like $1.19 a yard or something like that. Nowadays, those prices would just seem unreally cheap, But so I bought a few yards of the cloth, and I bought a few yards of the woven roving, and I bought a big gallon of polyester resin, which I think was like $12 for the gallon of polyester resin, and took it all home, some sandpaper, sanding discs, and everything I'd need. So on the weekend first weekend, I was right up inside that boat, tearing the floor out of it and getting it all open for repair and sanding it, and putting the woven roving down on the inside over the hole, and putting cloth on the outside over the hole, and letting it harden up, and I was doing some more sanding, and I must have been working on that boat for 2 months on the weekends. Finally, I had it finished, and you couldn't even tell there'd been a hole in it, hardly. I did a nice job on it, spray painted over it and everything, and made it look all fresh and new and everything, and so had the boat all done in about 2 months. And then I went looking for an engine. So back in those days, they had this, you used to go in the back of the newspaper, and they used to have what was called want ads, or the ads that were in the people selling things. And they used to do it in the newspapers in those days. So I went through, and I was looking at motorboat engines, outboard engines. And I wanted at least 15 horsepower, but I was thinking I'd probably want to get something a little bit larger even than 15 horsepower, maybe as most horsepower I could get, because it was a ski boat after all, So I was on there looking for engines for a week or two, and I said, oh my goodness, to my mother, they're so expensive. I can't afford these. I can't afford $1,500 for a almost new 90 horsepower engine. It's a lot of money, $1,500 back in those days, and I only paid $100 for the boat. I wasn't going to pay 15 times that much for an engine, So I kept looking and looking, and all of a sudden one day, I think it was like $75, there was a 30 horsepower Johnson in there. I got my dad to drive all the way into Eustis, and I drove in with him. We took a look at this engine. And it was an old engine. Do you remember those old Johnson engines that had the shroud that covers the engine wasn't square like the newer engines? It was one of those old round ones, I think from the 1950s or whatever. The round shroud, the engine must have been made in the 1940s or 1950s. But the old thing still run. It run good, and it would run on the first pull. Pull started. Start right up. It was actually a good running old engine. So I bought it. So I had my engine for my boat. So I took it out the boat on the first weekend after I got my engine. And I started to learn how to drive the boat around the what's called inland waterway in Florida. Drive it up and down the inland waterway, and I did some fishing and took George out fishing with it and everything else. So a month or two went by, and every weekend I'd be out, and me and George would go fishing in the boat. And George was my fishing buddy down in those days, And I got really, very good at driving this boat around. And good at using the engine. And so I decided that I needed an auxiliary engine in case my main engine quit. So I did the same thing. Went into the papers and I started looking around. And I found this 7.5 horsepower Elgin engine that was on sale. A smaller engine. It was small and it was compact and portable. It might have been 4.5 horsepower. It wasn't a very big engine. It was quite a bit, considerably smaller than the Johnson. It was made by Elgin, a company called Elgin. So I bought it, and I think I paid like $45 for it or something. So I had two engines, and it was going to be my auxiliary engine that I carry in the boat. So went fishing quite a few times after that. Had a pretty good time. So one weekend, Pop decided he wanted to go fishing with me and George. Going to be the three of us, And Pop had never been on the boat before, and he wanted to go fishing, and he wanted to have some fun, that Saturday, have a day out for the three of us. So we met in the morning. George came over. He was ready to go, had his tackle box out and everything, and I had my tackle box out, and Pop, he was gearing up his fishing poles and everything else, And we all left in the same car with the boat on the trailer on the back, And we drove all the way down. It was about a 40-minute drive to where we launched the boat at the launching ramps, public launching ramps, down for the intercoastal waterway. And we got out, we had fun fishing for about, maybe 4 hours, way late into the afternoon. And there started to be these storm cells started to develop. These, what in Florida we used to call thunderheads. And what they were these big, towering cumulonimbus clouds that had thunder and lightning at the base, but they just kind of float around on the intercoastal waterway. So where we were sunny, but there's a number of these storms developing quite close by. And you could hear the lightning off in the distance. And one of these storms in particular started to move toward us. But I was keeping my eye on it. But it was still a ways off. But you could see it was dark near the base. And it was lightning coming out of it. But it was still sunny where we were. So Pop says, listen, you've been driving the boat all morning to me. He says, let me take a go at driving the boat, he says. He says, because I kind of always wanted to drive a boat. And so it was his first time driving a boat. So I didn't really question it or anything because Pop was a good driver and it never really clued into me that there'd be a problem. I was, yeah, okay, that's fine. You can drive my boat. So Pop got behind the steering wheel, I think the boat had a seat. One seat, and it had a little thing that would control the motor, like in the seat, and it had a steering wheel. Actually had a steering wheel, But see, the thing about this is Pop's used to driving cars, so all that felt pretty natural to him when he hopped in behind the wheel. He sat down in the seat. It felt just like a car, so I think George started the engine for him, and the engine was in the back, the bubbles coming up out of the water, it was in neutral, Pop was sitting there, and he says, let's see, how does this work? Okay, this is N for neutral, and this is drive, and it goes forward, and he says, okay, I got that, and I understand that, it's steering wheel. He says, this is pretty obvious, I should be able to drive this just fine. So he engages the boat and he starts driving along, and He was driving. We were driving along fairly slow. What we'd call in seaman's terms about 5 knots, which is about maybe 6 miles per hour. And that's typical boat speed if you're out fishing. If you guys been out fishing, and the engine wasn't revving up much, but Pop was really having fun. There was a big smile on his face, and he was driving this boat around. But I'll tell you about the intercoastal waterways. There's a lot of deep sections down there around Florida there but there's a lot of shallow sections where and they're not obvious, these shallow areas. And also about a boat is you don't have any brakes with a boat like you do with a car. So Pop was driving along and he was having fun and everything. And he says, "Let's see what this thing can do." So he pushes her forward they don't have accelerator, but they determines the engine speed. I can't think of what they're called. Anyway, he slides the knob forwards and the old engine picks up. And after all, she still is a 30 horsepower engine, which even though she's probably made in the 1950s, she's still got quite a little bit of guts, that old Johnson engine, and you got her revving up, and we must have been hitting the maybe 15 or 20 knots, which is about probably over 20 miles an hour, when he wound that engine up. So everything was going fine. We were just scooting right along, and for some reason, Pop made a left-hand turn, started heading in toward closer to shore, and I said, "Pop, pop, pop, pop!" I touched on this, pulling on his arm. I said, "Pop, pop, pop! You're heading toward the shoals." And he was heading toward, and he couldn't see it because it was underwater, but the depth of the water at that point was only about 1.5 feet on those shoals. Probably in the mucky old things like oyster beds underneath the shoals, But you couldn't see it because it was underwater, but it was only about 1.5 feet deep underneath the water, and he was heading there for 20 miles an hour, as fast as he could go, 25 miles an hour. And before I could do anything, he hit the shoals. And I looked behind the boat, and I noticed we were going a lot slower, and I noticed that the boat was chugging through all of this mud coming up behind the boat, Pop was like, what's this? What's this? I said, "I told you." I said, "Don't go that way." And all of a sudden, kaping. And the motor was going, rawr, rawr, and chewing through all this mud. Kaping. He blew the cotter pin he popped the cotter pin on the part of the motor that runs the blade, I almost said fan blade, but you guys know, the propeller. Why I couldn't think of that word. It snapped, there's a little cotter pin on that propeller that runs on the shaft, and he sheared that cotter pin right off. So the motor was just racing up, and it wasn't spinning the propeller any longer. So we kind of put down anchor right there, and we kind of figured out what was going on. George knew right away. He said, "You've sheared the propeller off. You've sheared the propeller pin off. What are we going to do? What are we going to do?" "Well, let's pull the motor up, guys, and let's set her inside the boat, and let's put the auxiliary motor in." So that's what we did. We pulled her up, the motor, set her down between the seats in the boat on the floor, and we put on that little Elgin motor. I think it might have been 4.5 horsepower, but we put it on, got the boat turned around, pushed her off the shoals into the deeper water, started the little Elgin motor up, and we were on our way again. So we said, well, we better start making our way back toward the dock, because it is getting kind of late in the day, and that storm over there is getting an awful lot closer. Looked over and you could see this big black-looking storm, and we could see the base of the storm was getting an awful lot closer to us than it was before. We ran into all this trouble. So we started putt-putting our way. And this motor was not near as fast. We were doing about maybe, at full throttle, we were probably only doing about, I don't know, maybe 4 miles an hour, But it was better than rowing. Anyway, so we were heading along, and we were about 2 miles away from the dock. So George is kind of fishing as we were going along. He was trying to troll and trying to get something to bite, And I was driving. Pop says to me, he says, after a few minutes went by, and we were only about a mile away from the dock. We made a whole mile back toward the dock. Pop says to me, let me drive her one more time. Let me drive the boat one more time, Pop says. I said, Pop, you've already busted one of my motors. I said, we only got one motor left. I said, are you sure you want to try to drive this one more time? He says, yes, I want to try one more time. He says, I won't do that again. So he got behind the wheel and he started driving the boat. Everything went fine for about the first 5 or 10 minutes. We were only about 3/4 of a mile away from the dock by then. And Pop started turning the boat and started going over towards a new set of shoals. And I said, Pop, there's shoals over there. He said, what's that? And he kept driving it. And he did the same thing a second time with the little motor. Exactly the same thing. And he shortened the second pin off. And the three of us were sitting there, and we were like shaking our heads. We were like, well, how are we going to get back? And by this time, that storm was getting so close, and the sky was starting to get dark because the storm was really getting close to us by this time. And it was obvious it was coming for us. And I mean, it had a lot of rain in it. It was black looking. And we could hear lightning off in the distance. And here we were with a second shorn pin. So we hauled this engine out and laid it on the floor. And we had about 3/4 of a mile to go to get back to the wharf. And so I forget how things went, but we were all a little bit upset at this point. And George was more upset than me or my pop, Because he'd been fishing a lot, and he knew that we were stuck out there with a storm coming. He was pretty upset about this. So this boat went driving by, the first boat, after we waited there for about 5 or 10 minutes, and the storm was even getting closer. A boat went driving by, and we were trying to use the oar we had in the boat. We had one oar in the boat. And we were trying to move the boat with the oar, but we weren't being very much successful. I think we only went a few 100 feet. And this first boat drove by, and he was obviously heading back into the inlet because this storm was getting really close. And I watched him drive by, I think, while my pop was fishing around with the oar, trying to move the boat, him and George. I watched the first guy go by. Then another guy was coming down the river, and I could see him coming. And I stood up in the boat, and I waved both arms over my head. And the second guy saw me, the guy who was in another boat going down the river, heading toward the dock, seen me waving both arms over my head, and he pulled over within about 100 feet within my boat, and he says, are you okay? He yells at us. He pulls his boat over next to our boat. And he says, are you okay? And I says, we busted an engine. We're trying to get back in because the storm's coming. He says, that's no problem. He says, I'll throw you a line. And I'll drag you back in to the docks. And I says, oh, thank you so much. I says, that's exactly what we need. And so the guy pulled over within about 50 feet of me. And he threw me a line. And the line kind of fell across the boat, and I grabbed it, and I reached up, and I gave it a turn, one loop around the cleat, And I gave it a second loop around the cleat, and I was just working on the third loop around the cleat on the front of the boat, and he took off. The guy, vroom, a big wake come out from behind his boat, and I noticed he had these two big twin engines on the back of his boat, and I think they were about 90 horsepower each. And when he took off, I could feel the rope slipping out. Like, I had one end of the rope, I was still holding it, but the rope started slipping even with the maybe 3 loops around the cleat. And so I reached forward real quick, and I put my hand as tight as I could around those ropes on the cleat, and I held them nice and tight so that it wouldn't slip. And I could feel it was trying to slip because there's so much tension on it. And then we took off, and I'm going to tell you what, we took off. He had us going over 50 miles an hour. That boat's never been gone so fast in her life. And we were going so fast that whenever you could barely keep your eyes open because your eyes would start tearing because of all the wind going by. I think George's hat blew off of his head. And my dad was ducked down kind of between the seats. He kept his head ducked down below the windscreen. And the three of us were just flying across the water. It took all of about 30 seconds for us to get that 3/4 of a mile from where we were to where the docks were. And the guy's boat was sitting there going, rub, 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 rub. You know, I forget now. He might have had an inboard. I don't know what he had in that thing, but he had some power. I don't know. We might have been going 60 miles an hour. I mean, it's hard to judge speed when you can hardly keep your eyes open, for crying out loud, because of the wind. So we made it back to the docks. We loaded the boats back up on the trailer and took them home. And my father wasn't long fixing those shear pins on the boats on the propellers, you know. But it was quite a story. In fact, I think one of that old Johnson, I don't think it was the shear pin on the propeller that broke. I think it was the shear pin up on the engine. I just can't forget exactly what it was. But anyway, we had a pretty good time that day on the Intercoastal Waterway. Thank you guys for listening to my story, and we'll catch you guys next weekend and with another story, and we'll catch you guys Monday morning with this unfolding crisis within the banking system. I don't know if you guys have heard, but Janet Yellen got right up and she said, we're not going to cover all non-insured deposits. We're to pick and choose which ones we cover, the ones that are a systemic risk to the banking system. Now, I might not be quoting her exactly what she said verbatim, but that's the gist of it anyway, is that they're going to pick and choose what banks they cover the deposits on. That's what she was saying, that they're going to choose. So if you've got a deposit of, say, $260,000 and some small bank, and that bank decides to go under, Janet Yellen's going to choose whether you get your money back or not, essentially. And so any person who has what's nowadays considered to be a small amount, under $1 million or under $5 million or whatever, these are considered to be rather small companies and stuff, any person who has in a small bank, a small company, they're going to be sitting there thinking this weekend, hey, you know what? Maybe I should get my money out of this bank and move it into a bigger bank, and just in case my small bank goes under and my deposit's too large to be insured by the FDIC. they're going to start moving massive amounts of money. People are from these smaller banks to the bigger banks. So what happens is the smaller banks are going to start going under, going to continue to go under, because the smaller banks have invested a lot of this money that they have on hand in T-bills and in the debt market when interest rates were down near zero. And that's fine as long as they let those bonds run out to maturity. But the problem is if they have to sell those before they've run to maturity, those bonds are considerably less, because who wants to buy a bond with it's nearly 0% when they can get a bond at 4 or 5% interest rate per year? And so they're going to lose a lot of money on that if they have to sell before they mature. And if they have to sell before they mature, those unrealized losses in the bank from the treasuries and from the bonds that they hold are going to negatively impact their balance book. And it just makes them go down even quicker, especially if people are withdrawing their money out because they want to move it into a bigger bank. So you're getting hit with that double whammy, these small banks, the losses, unrecoverable losses, these losses that they're going to run into from the debt market, and people withdrawing their money out on the other end. So the money's bleeding out in two different directions. No wonder they're going bankrupt. Well, they will backstop the FDIC as long as they can. They will backstop depositors under $250,000. But, you hear what I said? As long as they can. And this is a big assumption that people are going to make, that the FDIC will be able to continue. When I heard as many as over 150 of these small banks are getting ready to go down or getting in trouble, and they could start to go down within the next week. How much can the FDIC cover before the FDIC has to be bailed out? I mean, this whole thing is just a total mess. But if you don't shuttle your money out one way or the other, if you just ignore all this, especially if you're in that category where you've got more than $250,000 in a small bank, and your small bank goes under, suddenly you're going to be wishing you didn't ignore it. Anyway, listen, guys, we'll catch you guys Monday morning in this developing situation, and we'll talk about what's happening, because I got to wait till Monday to see what's happening in the system. So Monday morning, real early, I'll be on the internet looking and finding out what's going on, and then reporting it back to you guys when I do my show in the afternoon. We'll catch you guys later. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.